So, ladies and gentlemen, as I said in my introduction, I'll be talking to you about the cost of life, which is not to be confused with the cost of living. Now, of course, we all agree that human life is so precious that it seems a little crass to try and put a price on it. I mean, how can a pile of coins or a pile of paper notes or gold bars match life? Surely it can't. Surely life should be literally invaluable. Well, I suppose philosophically we can all go along with that idea, but then sometimes real life offers us moments in which, when push comes to a shove, a figure has to be put on human life. Let's look at a few examples. One of the first things that came to mind when I was thinking about this whole issue was kidnapping. Granted, it's a fairly rare occurrence in Western societies nowadays, but I think we agree that it's a time in which getting back a loved one from his or her captors comes with a price tag, and usually a pretty hefty one. And then, of course, there are specifics in a kidnapping. How rich is the family, for example? The price of a human life in that case is somewhere between what the kidnappers think they can get away with and how much a family is prepared to pay back. I researched kidnapping a little this morning, and I found that record-breaking Argentina back in the 70s made for a kidnapper's paradise. And during the golden days of kidnapping, back in the 1970s, there was a record ransom requested once for a father and son that were kidnapped together, and they were grain merchants, so they traded in, grain, cereals, I don't know exactly what it means. And the ransom requested at the time was $60 million. Now, if you adjust that to inflation, nowadays it would be equivalent to $300 million. So basically, one life worth $150 million. Pretty impressive. Another scenario that came to mind is military operations, hostage rescue operations. And here, generally speaking, at least Western powers will go to extreme lengths to save the life of a citizen who is either in a war zone or is in a hostage situation, or including closer to home, particularly if there is strong media coverage. Now, operations like these cost anywhere in the area of tens of thousands. I might imagine maybe 100,000 euros, something of the sort. Given that it's often a group of hostages, you might want to break down the figure. Maybe that means that one life will cost, maybe 5,000, 10,000. Okay, it doesn't cost that much, but that's what it's perceived as being worth. But as we move down the scale, and we look at more recent events, if we look, for example, at how many refugees are dying in the Mediterranean every year, and how much effort is being made to try and save those lives, you might argue that in some cases, the life of a human being is worth very little indeed. But today I'd like to come with a more scientific approach and look at things from a medical perspective. In other words, we're looking at normal situations and normal people situations which we might all be confronted with at some point in our lives. And the question that the medical profession has to ask itself virtually constantly is, when is it that our bodies have grown too old and are too ill and are becoming too expensive to maintain? Now, you might find that this question is a little morbid, but it is, nevertheless, a very real-life question. Now, of course, our gut instinct will be to say, well, we should surely all do everything that we can to buy more people, particularly to buy more time for the people we love. But recently, this idea is being increasingly challenged. A number of assumptions are being questioned, and people are actually looking very hard to see exactly how much we would be willing to pay for a longer life. More specifically, if people have limited money to spend, and indeed states and health budgets have limited money to spend on the sick and dying, when there's a new drug available, a choice will always have to be made. In other words, will the few stolen months, maybe stolen years, be worth the money a drug costs? And right now, there is an objective criteria which is used to measure whether or not that new drug should be used or not. And this new yardstick, this new benchmark, you might want to call it, takes into consideration two aspects. One is the lifespan, so the duration of life, and the other is the quality of life. If you combine these two factors, you get that strange acronym I gave you earlier, the QALY, in other words, the Quality Adjusted Life Year. Now, let me give you an example. If you have a drug that helps you live an extra year, but during that year you will be living at half of your usual quality, let's say you'll be bound to a bed, for example, in that case, you consider that the drug scores 1 for the year, but only half for quality. Almost raise my middle finger. So it would get an overall score of 0.5, or 0.5 rather. Whereas a drug that improved your quality of life for a year and maintained the same quality would get a score of 1. So based on this calculation, a health service will look at the price of a drug and see if it's worth the cost. Now, let's look at the UK, for example. The recommendation is that you can spend £20,000 to £30,000 for each additional year of good health. So a drug that achieves 0.5 on the scale I mentioned earlier can only be worth half of the amount I gave earlier. In other words, it can only cost anywhere between £10,000 and £15,000. Now, this means, as a consequence, that certain drugs will have to be rejected, as hard as this may sound. If you look at the British National Health Service, for example, recently it had to look at a pharmaceutical product called Cadicla, never mind what the name is, it's a breast cancer drug. And it only extends, in inverted commas, extends the lifespan by about 6 months. And it costs £95,000 for that period. So even if the quality of life during those few months is equal to that of a healthy person, in other words, it would get a score of 1 if you look at the quality of life, it still overshoots the limit completely. In other words, it was rejected by the NHS. Of course, one of the arguments is that, well, we shouldn't be deciding how much a life is worth. We should be insisting that pharmaceutical companies should lower the cost of such treatments. Fair enough, but you will still be faced with this kind of dilemma at some point anyway. Anyway, recently the UK has decided to be a bit more generous and to raise a threshold. And apparently now for terminal illnesses, they are prepared to pay up to £80,000 for each quality-adjusted year saved. So again, based on that calculation I mentioned earlier. And many people consider that this attitude is completely understandable because, of course, any doctor looking after a patient has to advocate for them and has to say, I know it's expensive, but my first duty is to help you. However, you also have to put all these things on the general scales of healthcare and say, okay, well, if we're paying so much for this kind of care, aren't we taking money away from people with disabilities? After all, it might be crucial, even more important, to improve the quality of life for people who are at the beginning or at the middle of their lives. So the big question is it worth giving up on the comfort of one person to buy another person a few more months at the end of their life? And it's interesting that, in fact, public opinion doesn't necessarily consider that a life should be extended at all costs. And a number of studies were carried out that confirm this idea. For example, in the UK, there was a survey carried out and 4,000 people responded. And the general idea was that people weren't comfortable with giving even more money to the terminally ill if this were to be to the detriment of people who might benefit far more from the same money at other stages of their lives. Now, clearly, this kind of survey will not provide the final answer, and it's difficult to know, based on what culture you belong to what extent this kind of reflection is shared. Whatever the case may be, I think that a lot more consideration, a lot more thought should go into this general, more philosophical approach to medical care. And also, I think that we may not be faced with this kind of dilemma. In fact, I very much wish for all of you not to be faced with this kind of dilemma, either for you personally or indeed for your loved ones. But certainly, as we try and form an opinion about this whole subject matter, decided indeed at how long we would like to live, and indeed if we would like to live in less than ideal conditions, we can use this time to appreciate fully the value of our time on earth, and indeed what we are doing to make the most of this time. And indeed, I think that one of the best ways of making use of this time will be to go and have a drink after today's practice session, and hopefully soon we will have blissfully forgotten that we are all merely mortal.